Ladies and gentlemen, in 1860, when South Carolina was about to secede from the Union, one of its most distinguished statesmen, James L. Pettigrew, happened to be asked by a stranger the way to the Charleston Insane Asylum. He replied, "My dear sir, take any road. You can't go wrong. The whole state is one vast insane asylum." Well, today, if anybody should, by some rare chance, ask you the way to an institution for the mentally deficient, your answer would require even less hesitation. Mister, you could tell him, don't budge an inch. You're not only in the middle of one, but you can't get out. Not only is the whole country now one vast insane asylum, but they are letting the worst patients run the place. And just about the only inmates they ever lock up anymore are those that come nearest to being sane. Now, some of you may think I am exaggerating, and let's hope that I am. But before jumping to any conclusion, let's examine some of the evidence. Or, as an eminently sane American used to say near the end of our more lucid era, let's look at the record. And we mean, let's look quite seriously at the proofs all around us that the American people as a whole are being led to act as if they had literally lost their senses. We contend, for instance, that for our government to give millions of dollars of American money to communist Poland, which Poland in turn and immediately gives to Ho Chi Minh's communist regime in North Vietnam, whom we are now fighting in South Vietnam, we say that this borders on insanity. We contend that for the United States government to pay for the sending of bubble gum to Turkey, or Metrocol to Cambodia, or $4 million worth of sex stimulants to nationalist China, all under the guise of international development, well, we don't know exactly what it is they are supposed to be developing, but we say that all of this is close to insanity. A year or more ago, we saw by far the strongest nation on earth, our own, allow its citizens to be murdered in the Congo by a frenzied mob of communist-inspired and communist-controlled savages. Everything about the whole affair was planned and handled so as to reduce confidence in the United States and to increase the fear of the communists among the Africans. The ultimate intention, of course, was to destroy the morale of the anti-communists in Africa and paralyze their will to resist. In the midst of these massacres, our Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, gave a tremendous boost to this communist purpose by publicly begging the most bestial communist viceroy in that part of the world, Jomo Kenyatta, to use his influence to save our citizens. Then we allowed our belated sending of planes to save some of our people to be presented by propaganda as meddling in the affairs of small nations. And the question was never even raised of demanding that the murdering savages be rounded up and tried for their crimes. In Asia, these demonstrations of utter and vicious contempt for the supposed power and trustworthiness of the United States have been referred to as ringing the tail of the paper tiger, and have long played a most important part in the gradual surrender of that whole continent to the native communist commissars anointed by Moscow. Now, we have been seeing exactly the same formula at work in Africa. Any anti-communist African leader, white or black, who is beguiled into putting the slightest trust in the ballyhooed and pretended opposition of Washington to communism, soon finds himself betrayed by Washington and destroyed by the logic of events. And we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that this course on the part of our government, in the circumstances that actually prevail in the world today, and in the light of past experience, amounts to sheer insanity. Or, let's look at a more serious and more immediate problem. the so-called war in Vietnam. Is it really a war, or isn't it? Nobody seems to know. We are told in one breath by the administration that it is simply a police action against guerrillas within the boundaries of one country, South Vietnam, and hence that no declaration of war was feasible, for against whom would we declare it? But in the next breath, the President himself proclaims that this is war. And we read in our newspapers of bombing expeditions by our planes against various points in the supposedly independent country of North Vietnam, and about peace feelers to and from the government of that country. But whether police action or war, under whose command is it being fought? The American people assume that since we are supplying all of the soldiers, except, of course, the South Vietnamese themselves, and since we are paying all of the bills, this war is being run by the United States. But the pundits of the Walter Lippmann School are telling us that actually, due to our treaty commitments, the war is being run and must be run by SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And when we read still further, we learn that since SEATO is, in effect, a child of the United Nations family, the ultimate management of this war is in United Nations hands. Which means that, exactly as was the case in our Korean police action, everything we do to fight the communists in Vietnam will in time be reported to and will really be controlled by the Undersecretary of the United Nations for Security Council Affairs. And this position, by original agreement when the United Nations was founded, is always held by a communist. If that is not insanity, it will certainly do until some even crazier arrangement can be contrived. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is only the beginning of the lunacy now prevailing over Vietnam. For the next inescapable question is, when are we going to win this war, and why not? Is it possible, after our spending $40 to $50 billion per year on our military forces, since the memory of man runneth hardly to the contrary, that we cannot lick a puny bunch of half-starved guerrillas in a country about the size of Missouri? And if we can't, why not let Chiang Kai-shek do it for us, or at least help us? He has over 500,000 veteran and well-trained soldiers whose whole ambition in life is to have a chance and be allowed to fight communists on the mainland of Asia. In the Korean mess, our government was begging other nations all over the earth to send troops to help us. We made a big fuss over the fact that Turkey sent 5,000 men. But even after the Korean conflict was made a whole new war by Red Chinese forces, we refused, or more accurately, the United Nations refused, to let Chiang Kai-shek participate at all. And this was despite the fact that for this particular kind of a war, his forces were worth more than those of all other potential allies put together. Are we to repeat that idiocy now? Or do we repeat it even as this police action gradually escalates into a much larger affair with the Red Chinese involved in accordance with the obvious wishes and intentions of the administration? Who else ever refused the services in any struggle of a well-equipped, unusually friendly, and extremely dedicated ally who is practically right on the scene? Are we willing to allow tens of thousands and perhaps presently hundreds of thousands of American boys to be killed or crippled or captured annually for years to come instead of going ahead and fighting this war to win it with the weapons and the allies we have available? Are the American people, having experienced all of these same combinations of treason, cross-purposes, and stupidity in the Korean War, actually going to put up with them a second time? If so, some new phrase is needed for our description. Insanity is too mild a word. This childish gullibility is made even more pathetic by the ease with which the communists play upon it. For they know that the American people as a whole are earnestly anti-communist and will make more sacrifices and put up with more abuses from their own government for the sake of fighting communism than for any other purpose. So the problem of how thus to get and keep the United States involved in Vietnam had, for the communists, a very simple solution. All they needed was merely to have a few thousand of their agents and dupes and stooges stage some parades and establish some picket lines protesting our being in Vietnam and demanding that we withdraw. And at once, with the help of high-ranking propagandists who are not recognized as pro-communist, the American people become convinced that the communists do not want us fighting in Vietnam, and that therefore we must support the administration in doing so. This ruse of getting what they want by the principle of reversal applied in this manner is so old and so familiar to the communists that they did not even have to give it a second thought. Yet the whole official line as to what we are doing in Vietnam is as nutty as a pecan pie, as anybody can see who will stop and think about it honestly for even 5 minutes. If our government really wanted to rout the communists out of any area, why go 10,000 miles away to do so under such ridiculous handicaps and confusion? What's the matter with putting the same effort into an honest attempt to drive the communists out of Cuba, right here on our doorstep, and where this communist base is infinitely more dangerous to ourselves? This same administration has just recently gone so far in helping the communists to reestablish their rulership in the Dominican Republic as to have military agents of our government literally and physically kidnap at gunpoint the leading anti-communists, General Weizen y Weizen, in that country. How can anybody believe that the same administration is seriously interested in saving Vietnam from identically the same international communist tyranny? The gaudy shell of pretense by which the comsimps have promoted us into this growing war in Vietnam is so transparent and so flimsy that it would collapse under even a modicum of common sense. But how are we to get that common sense applied? Or will the American people simply never learn from experience? Finally, we come to the $64 question about Vietnam. What are we fighting for? What are we trying to accomplish? What are our goals? What is our real purpose? Nobody knows, or at least nobody in the administration is willing to say. And it is only when that question is answered honestly that the whole business makes sense, and thus paradoxically becomes crazier than ever. For the purpose of our being at war in Vietnam, ladies and gentlemen, is simply to be at war. The ages-old advice to rulers was phrased by Shakespeare as follows: "Be it thy course to busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels." That formula is being used on the American people today with double-barreled effectiveness. For the objective is not simply to distract the attention of gullible minds from the steady advance of state socialism and government regimentation at home, although this it certainly does, but the more sinister, though parallel purpose, is to use the very fact of our being at war as an excuse and a means of speeding up that advance, of gradually completing the transition into state socialism, and of converting the increasing and tightening regimentation into the framework of a totalitarian police state. Unless sufficient understanding of what is happening can be created to force a postponement of administration plans, the rationing of food and fuels, the allocation of materials, the imposition of price and wage controls, and far more drastic regulation by a central government of every detail of our daily lives are all just around a few corners, not very far ahead. And the fact that we are at war is to be the excuse and the means for suppressing all opposition to such policies, for brutally tightening the arbitrary enforcement of government regulations, for making all opposition to government policies synonymous with treason, for ruthlessly liquidating all resistance, and for irresistibly fastening the shackles of the police state around the bodies and over the lives of all the American people. To allow this to be done at all requires an ignorance of the history of the past 50 years and a giddiness of mind with regard to what really matters, which have both been carefully induced by decades of communist planning and propaganda. But to allow it because of our deliberate involvement in a repetition of the Korean travesty would make the occupants of any self-respecting insane asylum ashamed to have us around. All of this process is to be helped, immensely and vitally, of course, by other manifestations of lunacy to which we have been gradually and insidiously conditioned, some of which we shall be discussing further along in this very speech. It is also to be a part of a worldwide process going on simultaneously everywhere with the unceasing help of our government to bring the remaining free peoples of our planet under the same communist one-world tyranny as ourselves. All over the earth, ladies and gentlemen, we see one nation after another being taken over by agents of the Kremlin who are known by everybody to be murderers, liars, and moral savages of the most depraved variety. And the top officials of our government not only treat all of these depraved beasts as human beings and honor them and negotiate with them and build up their prestige by giving them red carpet treatment as heads of state in Washington, but agencies of our government continuously aid them in every way possible to establish and consolidate their brutal rule over the helpless people they enslave. These actions on our part amount to nothing less than insanity. Or let's look closer home. But even with regard to our domestic absurdities, let's focus briefly at first on the city of Washington. Our government, running out of gold with which to support its own currency, and thus facing or even inviting the chaos and misery of wild inflation for our own people, continues to pour billions of American dollars in so-called foreign aid into the hands of communist-controlled regimes abroad, which billions of dollars these regimes can convert into more gold from us on demand. This amounts to insanity. Our government, in the midst of a fight to the death with communist enemies determined to enslave us, fills most of its high offices with men whose past records have proved them to be the most favorably inclined towards communism that can be found for the jobs. This borders on insanity, and the border is pretty thin. One of the leading idols or heroes of the communists in the United States, is made emphatically clear by their own pronouncements and actions, is Chief Justice Earl Warren. Yet this man, on the insistence of the communist newspaper, The Worker, was made chairman of an official commission to investigate the murder of a president of the United States by a known communist. We say that this is so absurd as to approach insanity. While we are engaged in this life and death struggle with communism, our government gives the valuable boon of tax deductibility on contributions to every little left-wing one-horse outfit which promotes communist propaganda and purposes, and also to huge so-called foundations that are helping the communist advance. Yet the same government refuses this status to organizations actually opposing communism and is even taking it away from those that already have it. We contend that this is insane. Our government's enforcement of even the extremely liberal and studiously prepared McCarran-Walter immigration law had for years been so lax and so dishonest that on the authority of Congressman Walter himself, while he was still chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, there were already more aliens illegally in this country than we had men in our total armed forces. Then the present administration put all of its prestige and pressures into emasculating and eliminating immigration restrictions almost entirely, and into thus allowing unmeasured floods of communist-controlled aliens to enter our nation for the very purpose of helping to subjugate it to communism. And finally, we now have the deal with Castro, whereby anybody can come in from Cuba with no questions asked, which means, of course, that any communist from anywhere in the world can enter our country freely and openly by merely coming through Cuba in the transparent guise of being a Cuban refugee. What's more, we have been sending our planes to bring these people into Florida from Cuba. And the very first such refugee who stepped ashore from the first plane was not a Cuban at all, but a European who had previously been deported from our country as an undesirable alien. You can easily imagine the part that the communists among these refugees will play in stirring up racial troubles in the South and in directing these troubles to the service of communist purposes. Actually, our country is now loaded with alien communists at key troublemaking spots everywhere, ready to create serious disorders of every kind. And we say that the whole policy our government has followed and is following with regard to immigration is dangerously insane. Our government not only allows thousands of tons of communist propaganda in the form of magazines and pamphlets from Soviet Russia itself and from the satellite nations to flood our country every year, and note that I said and meant thousands of tons, but it actually uses the facilities of the United States Post Office Department to distribute much of this communist propaganda to individuals all over our country at what amounts to no cost at all to the Soviets. One of the many purposes served by this mail is to let good American citizens who still have relatives living in Russia or the satellite nations know that their names and American addresses are on record in Moscow or Warsaw or Prague or wherever a particular communist magazine originates. This subtle blackmail is a tremendous deterrent to any anti-communist action by even the most patriotic and determined anti-communists among these first and second generation Americans. And we contend that for our government to be an active party to this gigantic blackmail scheme amounts to insanity. But let's come now to a far more serious exhibition of lunacy. Ever since 1928, the communists have been working steadily on the application to our country of one of the most cruel but most important formulas in their whole book of strategy. This calls for creating an ostensible revolutionary movement and demand for independence among so-called colonial peoples. Since these movements have been based on supposititious feelings and aspirations which did not really exist among the native populations, the communist formula has called for the use of infinite cruelty and terror to force enough of such native populations to support or to appear to support these insurrectionary movements as to give the guerrilla-made murders and vandalism some semblance of a civil war. For this minimum of fire has been needed under all of the tremendous billows of smoke in order to enable the communists to do the rest. With the constant help of our government and of the United Nations, and through propaganda, diplomatic maneuvers, and brazen audacity, the communists have finally arranged with regard to one colonial area after another for those ultimate negotiations that set out each area into a condition of theoretical independence. And this so-called independence, of course, is simply a transitional stage for the new country on its way to becoming a Soviet colony or satellite. We believe that in support of this cruel worldwide program extending over the past 40 years, more human beings have been murdered, usually in the most cruel ways or by the most horrible tortures, than at any other time or for any other purpose in all human history. For it took this kind and quantity of terrorization to enable Mao Zedong of China and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam and Ahmed Sukarno of Indonesia and Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and a dozen others like them, even to be able to pretend that they had any native backing in their so-called drives for freedom and independence. And always it was the best citizens among the native populations that were tortured and murdered, while the scum and the criminals rose towards the top in support of the communist movement. Now, we have identically the same procedure underway with regard to the Negroes of the United States. And simultaneously, it just so happens, with regard to the French-speaking Catholic population of Canada in a communist-managed separatist movement up there. But let's stick to our own country. In 1928, the strategy for the comrades in the United States with regard to the Negro question was laid down in a printed pamphlet by one John Pepper on the direct orders of Stalin. John Pepper, of course, as many of you know, was one of the many aliases of a brilliant degenerate who, as Joseph Pogany, had been a top associate of Bela Kun throughout all the horror of the short-lived Bela Kun communist regime in Hungary. But it was not expected that 1% of our American Negro citizens, or white citizens either, would ever learn who the man called John Pepper really was, or recognize the significance if they did. In this 1928 booklet, American Negro Problems, which we reprinted a couple of years ago by photo offset, incidentally, and which is readily available at 10 copies for $1 from American Opinion, Belmont, Massachusetts. In this booklet, Pogany Pepper established the official line that the Negroes in the United States constituted an oppressed colony, which should be stirred to a demand for its freedom and independence, with a separate Negro Soviet Republic to be formed out of our Dixie states as the ultimate goal. This same theme was repeated and further expounded in a new booklet by the communists Ford and Allen in 1934. Despite occasional soft peddling of this program, or even official backing away from this theme for tactical reasons, the same basis of communist agitation and goal of communist activity has been maintained and made increasingly clear to all American communists, white and black, right up to the present time. And as recently as June of 1964, the Executive Committee of the Communist Party USA made a quiet new distribution of thousands of copies of the Ford and Allen 1934 booklet, which was entitled The Negroes in a Soviet America. And incidentally, again simply for documentation, exact reprints of that booklet are also available from American Opinion at 3 copies for $1. Now, the point of all of this is that what has been happening in the South, and even in Harlem and Los Angeles and other places, including the increasing racial turmoil for the past several years, does not make sense unless you realize what the communists behind all of this agitation are trying to accomplish. Nor will the spreading riots and murders and vandalism of the future make sense unless you understand the communist plans to terrorize the ordinary, loyal Negro American citizens into supporting or appearing to support this drive for a separate, independent Negro Soviet Republic to be carved right out of the United States. In carrying out this scheme and to support propaganda based on it, not only will thousands of white citizens in the South be murdered by the comparatively few Negro criminals who can be inflamed by the communists to the point of actually participating in the terror, but exactly as for the Muslims in Algeria, tens of thousands of the best Negro citizens themselves will be tortured and killed as a part of the terrorization necessary to establish some communist Negro leader at the head of what will be called a Negro revolutionary movement for freedom and independence. And the Negroes themselves will be by far the heaviest sufferers from this brutal tyranny. The first brazen warning to the Negroes of the terror to be inflicted on them unless they fall in line has already appeared in the Perry Small case. Here was an 87-year-old Negro farmer and landowner in Greensboro, Alabama, who was quite proud of the country, which had enabled him to live a happy and successful life, who appreciated the true friendship and respect of his white neighbors, which he had enjoyed all of that life, who could see the communist plans and hands at work in the trouble and rioting and bitterness being created under the slogan of civil rights, and who was trying bravely and determinedly, in his small but effective way, to warn his fellow Negroes of the folly of letting themselves be used by the communists. In fact, he was going downtown to speak on the subject several nights per week to all that he could get to listen. And so, this good, wise, and truly patriotic American Negro, 87 years old, was beaten so badly with an iron skillet that he died without ever regaining consciousness. But note that his tongue was cut out before he was killed, so as to make the warning to other Negroes emphatically clear. This was typical of the kind of cruelties which the FLN communists had perpetrated on their fellow Muslims in Algeria on an average of 20 such atrocities per day for 7 years for identically this same purpose of intimidation. And it is exactly what we have said for years would be happening in the South as soon as the communists behind the civil rights fraud were ready to go that far on their plotted course. Now, all of this is absolutely clear to anybody who will take the trouble to read the communists' own publications and directions on the subject with any background knowledge of how they have now used exactly the same formula in so many other countries. All of this is bound to be known by many people in high positions in our federal government. Yet by far the greatest help the communists have had in advancing this program, help without which they could not even have established the foundations for their progress, and the most powerful support of those very agitators who are following this communist blueprint for the eventual dismemberment of our country, have come from the actions of our federal government or of various officials in that government. And we contend that these actions border on insanity. In fact, as we review the whole picture, far more extensive and panoramic than I have been able to paint it here, of all that Washington is doing to aid communist purposes in this country, not just in connection with the Negro revolutionary movement, but in so many other ways, we cannot help remembering the old Spanish adage that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. Acting on that principle and assuming that it applies to mental as well as physical sight, we are considering a campaign to gather and send to Washington a trainload of half-wits. This ought to assure a considerable improvement without making the change so rapid and so complete as to disturb the apathetic somnolence of the American people. But now, let's leave Washington busily braiding the rope with which to hang itself and look around us everywhere. Unfortunately, the story is very much the same, whether it is from the world of education, or the press, or religion, or entertainment, that we select our items for comment, as we shall indicate by simply mixing them up a bit. Today, a grade school teacher is not allowed to have the children say a prayer or read Bible verses in her classroom, while letting them shoot dice or stamp on the American flag is considered permissible, and in some high educational circles even praiseworthy. We contend that this borders on insanity. Today, many good Christians continue to contribute to their churches, knowing full well that some of their money thus goes to the National Council of Churches, while high-ranking committees of the National Council put out reading lists recommending some of the most blasphemous books ever published in America, and pornographic books with passages so vile that these passages cannot even be sent through the mails in letters of complaint. We say that this approaches insanity. In 1960, the man who is now President of the United States was running simultaneously for 2 offices, on the national ticket for the vice presidency, and in Texas for re-election to his seat in the United States Senate. And on issue after issue, the platforms of these 2 campaigns were diametrically opposed to each other. In other words, here was a candidate for very high offices, one of which could lead and did lead directly to the presidency, who was brazenly and officially talking out of both sides of his mouth throughout the whole campaign. And we contend that the American press could have ignored this incredible hypocrisy so nearly unanimously, and the American people could have swallowed it so readily, only in a world which has practically gone crazy. On Monday, January 11, 1965, the invited speaker at a compulsory school assembly at Mount Mercy College, a private Catholic school for girls in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was Bayard Rustin. The school has some 700 students. Mr. Rustin, it will be remembered, was chief organizer of the so-called March on Washington in August 1963, which march fitted so well into communist designs for troublemaking and propaganda. Mr. Rustin also has in his record a string of jail sentences and arrests for various offenses. These include at least one arrest and conviction involving sexual perversion. He once served as organizer for the Young Communist League and boasts of affiliation with many organizations which have been officially cited as communist fronts by various government agencies. And more recently, Mr. Rustin distinguished himself by expressing his resentment over the rescue from sadistic communist-inspired Congo savages of some of the Europeans and Americans these savages were murdering, including Catholic priests and nuns. And we contend that for the Catholic heads of this girls' college to invite this man to be an official speaker at a compulsory assembly is sheer insanity. John Birch was an American boy who went directly from theological school to become a missionary in China. When we got into the war against Japan, John volunteered for service, joined General Chennault's 14th United States Air Force in Chongqing, and during the next 3 years, through a combination of brilliance and bravery, became almost a legend while he was still alive. 10 days after the war was over, John Birch, as a captain in the United States Army, in uniform but on a peaceful mission, was brutally killed by Chinese communists near Suzhou, China, apparently to prevent the leadership, knowledge, and inspiration which they knew he would provide in opposition to communism in China. Since I wrote my small biography of John Birch in 1954, I have met or heard from many men who knew him during his years of service in China. Their comment to a man can be summed up in the words of another associate whom I quoted in my book. It was, "I came as near to worshiping John Birch as any man I have ever known." His nobility of character and of purpose was unsurpassed, and he was beyond all question one of the finest young men and greatest heroes America has ever produced. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, during the past 2 years, there has been started and pushed forward on several college campuses a purely paper organization known as the Tao Chu Kwang Society. Nobody knows the name of the Chinese communist who bayoneted the unarmed John Birch to death. And, of course, his name could have been Tao Chu Kwang. So the small advertisements of this fictitious society say, let's call him Tao Chu Kwang and use that name for our group. In short, these American college youngsters have now been so brainwashed in favor of communism that they promote an organization for the specific purpose of honoring the communist murderer of John Birch. And this, we contend, is typical of the insanity now creeping over America. Lenin once told his followers, we must hate. Hatred is the basis of communism. Children must be taught to hate their parents if the parents are not communists. And Anatol Lunacharsky, former Soviet Commissar of Education, once said, down with love of one's neighbors. What we need is hatred. We must know how to hate. Only thus shall we conquer the universe. Now, one of our great cardinal principles in the John Birch Society is that we do not hate anybody. We do not even hate Earl Warren. We hate only the evil principles and purposes which we think he represents. We do not hate any evil men, but only the evil which they do, and evil itself is an abstract force in a world which we hope to make better. Yet the communists, following their formula of always accusing their enemies of exactly what they themselves are doing, and of always exactly reversing all truth and even all language, refer to the John Birch Society unceasingly as a hate group, and succeed in having us so labeled automatically in that sizable percentage of the American press which, unwittingly or not, slavishly follows the communist line. So the American people come to accept the charge that we, and not the communists, are indulging in and fomenting hatred as a part of contemporary existence. And we contend that this acceptance by the public of so blatant a reversal of the truth, in this as in 1,000 other manifestations by the communists of the formula of exact reversal at work, that this childish folly is so great as to border on insanity. On New Year's Day, 1965, a group of several Protestant ministers representing 4 denominations and including Canon Robert Cromie, a special assistant to Episcopal Bishop James A. Pike, gave a ball in California Hall, San Francisco, for known homosexuals in the area. Much to the disgust and concern of the local police, there were some 600 homosexuals and their friends present at the party, for which a dance permit had been issued. Police Chief Thomas Cahill stated that his men had been required to police the affair after they understood that tickets were being sold at the door and liquor was being sold inside. And because these police found it necessary to make 5 or 6 arrests, most of which seemed to have been deliberately provoked, the San Francisco Chronicle carried a story on Sunday, January 3rd, with the headline, Incidents at a Homosexual Benefit, and then a larger headline, Angry Ministers Rip Police. In other words, the real complaint was against the police for interfering in any way with the boys having their fun at this public party given them by clergymen. And this whole affair, we contend, is a frightening measure and example of the atmosphere of insanity which is now permeating our daily lives. And so, my fellow inmates, let me remind you of the woman who sued her husband for divorce on the grounds that he was continuously drunk. "How long have you been married?" asked the judge. 3 years, Your Honor, she replied. "And how long has this continual drunkenness been going on?" persisted the judge. "Ever since I first met him, Your Honor, 6 months before we were married." "Then why on earth," the judge now asked, "have you waited this long to complain about this condition?" "Because, Your Honor," the lady replied ruefully, "it was not until last Wednesday, which was the first time I ever saw him sober, that I realized he had been drunk ever since I had known him." My point is that if you do not think you are living in what amounts to a gigantic insane asylum today, it is because you have become so accustomed to the manifestations of insanity all around you that you do not even recognize the condition. And it is the function and duty of the John Birch Society to bring a sound sense of values and some basic sanity back onto the scene, and to have more and more people stop and think just what idiocy they are accepting as a normal part of life. But when you start meditating about this madness all around us, you are soon struck by the fact that there is too much method in it. It is not insanity on the part of the conspirators, who are thus conditioning the American people for destruction, but only on the part of their victims. For every item falls in place on one of just 2 roads. These are the roads of collectivism and of immorality, which come together eventually into the slave compound known as communism. For the communists to impose their tyranny on America and maintain it, they must have the people gradually come to take for granted that there can be no questioning of either a central government's power or its wisdom. Even the most idiotic and unjustifiable extension of the fingers of government into our daily lives and actions must come to seem commonplace. And similarly, all conscience and all morality must be gradually eroded away until an individual's responsibility for his own immoral actions is completely forgotten in a flood of conformity to amoral customs on every side. Finally, the individual becomes resigned to a generally accepted doctrine that he has no rights or privileges or possessions except those which the state confers upon him. Finally, also, the individual's soul and conscience are crushed by an all-pervading moral nihilism into a hopeless confusion and despair. Then and only then can the communists rule peacefully, as they would put it, meaning with all resistance or even potential resistance effectively destroyed. And they can then do so in accordance with standardized communist practice by brute force and terror, with no real concern about any other motivation on the part of their subjects than hunger and fear. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that for more than 40 years, this incredibly diabolic conspiracy of criminals seeking ever more power and glory and perquisites for its members has been engaged in a subtle but gigantic program to destroy the three great basic human loyalties: loyalty to God, loyalty to country, and loyalty to family. They aim at, in fact, from their point of view, they simply must have a social organization in which there is no other loyalty possible except to themselves or to the state, which represents the structure of their power. The constant advances all around us today of collectivism and immorality have not just happened and have not even been due directly to the weaknesses of human nature, except as these weaknesses have been insidiously but aggressively played upon by agents of a conspiratorial nerve center which knew exactly what it was doing. And little by little in degree, while larger and larger in extensiveness, these planned and fomented movements down the paths of collectivism and immorality have now reached so far that we are living in a complete bedlam of political, economic, spiritual, and moral confusion which approaches insanity. Let us remind you of Pavlov's dogs and of the seriousness with which the communists have treated those experiments. The trainer takes a healthy and intelligent dog and teaches him first to follow and obey a series of varied signals in order to obtain food and kind treatment. Then suddenly the whole series is changed. The old signals or the dog's reactions to them no longer work, and the confused animal must somehow learn to interpret and follow the new directions. Or, translating this into the human terms in which the communists are really interested, the dog has had to accept a new sense of values. Then, by the time this is barely accomplished, the signals are all changed again. The dog has to forget the second set as well as traces of the first one, and, striving desperately to do what is expected of him, spurred on by both his need for food and his need for kindness, he somehow gradually grasps and follows enough of the new combination of directions and reactions to give him some food and more hope. But next, even this third set of signals and compliances fail to bring the expected results. All has been changed again. This time, to make the confusion, frustration, and despair even greater, various signals out of each of the three earlier sets are now combined in the series, so that the poor dog is hopelessly bewildered. This process continues of changing the signals, of putting in entirely new ones, altering the meaning of earlier ones, reversing the significance of those that have been learned, and otherwise making both memory and experience appear useless as guides to action. It goes on until the dog, still trying frantically and pitifully to understand and comply with what is wanted of him, accepting as right what all his past experience tells him is wrong, struggling to his utmost to fit into this insane environment in which he is a captive, or again, in human terms, having lost all sense of values, the poor dog at last breaks down mentally and becomes a whining idiot. After this stage is reached, he can once again be taught to perform the very simplest and most monotonous acts over and over for the sake of his daily food. But all intelligence, all spirit, and all hope have disappeared and left but a vacant stare. And let me urge you, ladies and gentlemen, as solemnly as I possibly can, to feel great pity for the dog of our illustration and to take heed from his fate. You had better have sympathy for the dog, for exactly the same thing is happening to yourselves. You have already been brought to the stage where you are losing all memory of what is right and wrong, discarding all experience, and denying that any sound and permanent sense of values even exists. The conspirators have only a few steps further to go, and the desperately bewildered American citizen, like Pavlov's dogs, will be ready to believe anything he is told, do anything he is ordered, and gratefully accept anything he is given by his master, the communist state. Your clergyman's party for the homosexuals, the sending of American boys to die in Korea or in Vietnam, where both sides of a sham and play-acting war are directed by the same influences, the driving of families out of their homes and neighborhood roots by that gigantic and cold-blooded invitation to fraud known as urban renewal, the constant stream of falsehoods and distortions in the American press or over the air, the efforts to make criminals out of our local police and heroes out of our criminals, the filling of half the drugstores in America with blasphemous and pornographic books and magazines, the constant honoring, even by the very heads of our own government, and also by great commercial and professional organizations, and by great universities, of men who are known by everybody to be murderers, liars, traitors, and degenerates of the most vicious order. The attempted conversion of our whole educational system into a vast training ground for the destruction of every sound sense of values and of all but the most criminal ambitions. The deliberate fomenting of friction and bitterness between Catholics and Protestants, between Jews and Gentiles, between whites and blacks, between management and labor. These and 1,000 other manifestations of the successful progress of the communist program now surround us on every side. And they do not have to be carried too much further now, before only the communist bosses already in the highest positions and holding all of the reins in their hands will be the only ones to know where and how thousands of ostensibly independent or spontaneous activities fit into the colossal puzzle they have created. Only these top communists will know who is an agent of theirs carrying out their plans and instructions as against the vast majority of gullible dupes or opportunistic cowards being led by the nose into such activities. The confusion will be so complete and the sense of futility on the part of even informed anti-communists so great that most of them will throw up their hands in despair and decide to drift at last with what seems to be an irrevocable tide. Or at least this is the result which the communists have intended. Breaking the will of people to resist, that is, to resist anything, no matter how idiotic it ought to sound, is at the very core of communist strategy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what we have been reviewing are communist plans and methods. But we do not have to let those plans be carried out to completion. Actually, the solution to all of this is very simple, but it is by no means easy. In fact, it is as huge and difficult a job as the communists planned it should be by the time they reached this point in their advance towards absolute enslavement of the total population of the earth. The size of the task, however, does not make it impossible, for its simplicity is all important. We must start by preserving our own sanity. And by this I mean, to use once again a phrase which I have repeated so often in this speech, by maintaining at all costs a sound, traditional, and morally based sense of values. If enough Americans would stand firmly enough on this foundation, it would be impossible for communist deceptions pressures and propaganda to keep on sweeping us further down the two roads of collectivism and immorality. To that end, it is up to each of us to do his part. First, by making sure of his own position, and second, by persuading others to do the same. As to the immense derangement so cunningly created all around us, there is a very simple compass by which each individual can guide himself. All that is necessary, as we have pointed out many times before, is for every civilized and patriotic man or woman to fall back on the moral code of the days when we really had one, and to judge every action of themselves and of others strictly by that moral code, without modification or exception. For in this increasing confusion of propaganda, appeasement, expediency, false leadership, and deceptive pretenses, there simply is no other criterion by which any good citizen can safely determine his course. Simply remember, firmly and confidently, that morality sees further than intellect. Morality sees further than intellect. But this is not enough. Let's emphasize this statement by looking first at the road to collectivism. There are many excellent lecturers and leaders throughout the country who are giving some very sound courses today on the follies and crimes of too much government, and on the value and necessity of the resolving by individuals to conduct their own lives and affairs strictly according to the principles of a free enterprise economy. We are all for these teachers, because few things are needed more now than to reconvert brainwashed American business and professional men back to a belief in classical economics. And each one who is persuaded to eschew collectivism at every turn in his own economic affairs, even when it would be temporarily to his advantage, is setting an example and having an impact which are of great value to the conservative cause. But the practical chances of stopping the communists simply by this process are today entirely negligible. In anything approaching a normal world, having enough lecturers preach this doctrine convincingly enough to enough listeners so as eventually to turn the tide back from collectivism towards complete non-intervention by government should be entirely possible. But when you have an enemy army marching over the hill, determined to destroy your city, you do not prevent this catastrophe by telling everybody in sight simply to go on about his business as usual. The army of our communist enemies is far worse, because these enemies wear no uniforms, do not march in visible formation, and are creeping up on our city imperceptibly but steadily from every side. And any thought that if you pay no attention to this great hostile tribe, but simply act yourself in the soundest peaceful traditions, the enemy will disappear, is a dangerous fallacy. Just as is the thought that if each individual American himself becomes strictly a free enterpriser, the threat of collectivism will go away. The cold hard fact is that the collectivist armies are now tightly managed and ruthlessly driven forward by criminal masters who are not themselves susceptible to reason, and who are both able and determined to see that such reason does not even reach their marching minions, simply from a relatively few thousand converts who are setting a good example. These converts, to do their real duty today, simply must add their weight and leadership to the organized forces that are striving to stop the collectivist hordes. Second, the same thing is true with regard to the road to immorality. We do not have any chance of stopping the communists from carrying our whole nation down that road at a stampeding rate simply by persuading enough individuals to say to themselves tomorrow, henceforth I'll do nothing which could cause even a twinge to my conscience. It is terribly important, but it is not enough today merely to be a good person yourself and to set a good example. The forces of evil are too well organized, too solidly entrenched and too far advanced for there to be enough time left for the process of individual example and conversion to save our religious ideals, our civilization, our freedom, or our lives. It is not enough today to be a good person, but the weight and leadership of good individuals must be added to the organized and concerted action of other good individuals if we are to save even our spiritual inheritance from such powerful and ruthless destroyers as now assail us on every side. So my point is not, in the mood of a devout preacher or a wise teacher, merely to urge upon our members and friends that they themselves be truly good individuals and responsibly self-reliant. Most of them already are. Otherwise, they would not be either members of or prospects for membership in the John Birch Society. What I am trying to make clear is that we need the concerted, mutually encouraging, organized effort of all such people in order to stand up to, stop, and eventually rout the extremely well-organized and brilliantly directed enemies who intend to enslave us. In brief, working together by example and precept and labor and leadership, let's try to start bringing some sanity back into American life and then help it to grow until it becomes a mighty burst of common sense and traditional values relighting the whole American scene. Ladies and gentlemen, just before this film was made, we were celebrating our 7th anniversary. As one part of that celebration, we ran full-page advertisements in many newspapers under the heading, "What is the John Birch Society?" For we were glad to use the occasion to give as much of an answer to that question as the space we could afford would permit. And we are now simply giving you, through this speech on film, the same information which appeared in print, plus a small amount of additional details and comments that may be helpful at a recruitment presentation. So, 1, let's start at the beginning. The John Birch Society was founded in Indianapolis on December 9, 1958. It was chartered under the general laws of Massachusetts as a non-profit educational organization. We have lived up meticulously to those specifications, including not making any profit, for 7 years. During these 7 years, we have sought to bring into the John Birch Society only men and women of good character, humane consciences, and religious ideals. For we are striving to set an example by dedication, integrity, and purpose, in word and deed, which our children's children may follow without hesitation. Members of the society are of all races, colors, and creeds. We are of all social, economic, and educational levels. We are individualists who disagree among ourselves about many things, but we are firmly united in devotion to those beliefs, principles, and purposes which we do hold in common. For we have voluntarily joined together, 1, to combat more effectively the evil forces which now threaten our freedom, our lives, our country, and our civilization. 2, to prevail upon our fellow citizens to start pulling out of the deepening morass of collectivism and then climb up the mountain to higher levels of individual freedom and responsibility than man has ever achieved before. 3, to restore with brighter luster and deeper conviction the faith-inspired morality, the spiritual sense of values, and the ennobling aspirations on which our Western civilization has been built. The long-range objective of the Society has been summarized as less government, more responsibility, and a better world. 2, so of course we collided with communism. for these purposes bring us immediately into conflict with the communists on two levels. On the ideological plane, the communists seek always and everywhere to bring about more government, less individual responsibility, and an immoral world. And on the plane of action, until the communists can be stopped from completing their subjugation of the whole world, there will be no opportunity for us to move forward at all towards our permanent goals. We have undertaken, therefore, to play a leading role in slowing down, stopping, and eventually routing the communist conspiracy. We realize that the one thing no conspiracy can withstand is the light of day on its activities. The only danger to their gigantic conspiracy, which the communists fear, is exposure. For this reason, we do all that we can to bring to our fellow citizens more knowledge and a better understanding of the methods, the progress, and the menace of the communist machine. In this undertaking, we have become a new form of opposition to the communists, which they have never faced before in any of the vast areas they have already taken over. So the communists, grasping this fact very early, set out in 1961 to destroy us. The most official communist publication in the United States is The Worker, in which the line is laid down for the faithful. During the last 6 months of 1961, there was, we believe, only one issue of this weekly which did not contain an attack somewhere in its pages on the John Birch Society. And a number of issues contained as many as 6 or 7 separate attacks on us at that many different places. The comsimps got the point and have been carrying out the indicated program with increasing furor ever since. Of course, the communists follow Lenin's basic strategy of advancing communism by non-communist hands. They could never impose the tyrannical rule of some 3% of a population over the whole population, which they repeatedly do in one country after another, unless they could inveigle enough non-communists and even anti-communists among that other 97% into doing their dirty work for them, deceptively appealing, for instance, to every motivation in human character, from sordid selfishness to practical politics to misguided idealism. They have gradually beguiled a lot of very good Americans into joining the attack on us, until the maligning of the John Birch Society has now probably exceeded in intensiveness and extensiveness that faced by any other organization in all American history. And in general, our defamers do not even try to refute the facts on which we focus attention. They merely call us names for bringing these facts to light. 3. Next, and in due course, we stirred up the politicians. This was inevitable, even though the John Birch Society is in no sense a political organization. We simply try to give our members information, understanding, and, we hope, even inspiration, which will make them better citizens. As good citizens, they may take an active part in politics, but each member does so entirely on his own, working in the party of his choice for the candidate of his choice, exactly as do members of the American Legion or of the Knights of Columbus or of the Rotary Club or a Baptist church. For we regard education as the means and political action as only the mechanics for bringing about improvements in government. The mechanics will automatically be used when sufficient education has prepared the way. We mean it quite literally, therefore, when we say that education is our total strategy and truth is our only weapon. Or, as made clear throughout the Blue Book and emphasized on its last page, our gigantic task is simply to create understanding. Members of the John Birch Society, however, are extremely hardworking, highly respected in their local communities, and always earnestly determined on behalf of any cause or candidate that they support. When circumstances bring any appreciable number together behind any particular candidate, their weight is out of all proportion to their numbers. And that weight is usually felt, of course, on the side of the conservatives of either party. So the liberals of both parties naturally raise all the clamor they can against Birchers in politics. As the stranglehold of the liberals on both parties now steadily increases, even conservative politicians feel unceasing pressures to improve their images by joining the chorus of attack on the John Birch Society. Very few of them indeed have ever realized the extent to which they were running interference for the communists. A related part of the mammoth and many-faceted campaign which the communists have now generated against us is the deliberate and widespread attempt to associate the John Birch Society in the public mind with the Communist Party, the Ku Klux Klan, and other so-called extremists of the left and of the right. Our approach to the problems of today is so different from the viewpoint of the clans that we have never knowingly admitted a member of any clan into the society. We estimate that about 40% of our total membership is Catholic. Many of our finest chapter leaders are Jewish, and we are very proud of our small but growing number of Negro members who are working so hard and so courageously with us to show our fellow citizens, both white and colored, how the Negroes are being used today by the communists to serve communist purposes. So we have no similarity or sympathy whatsoever with the clans. While the so-called American Nazi Party, according to J. Edgar Hoover, has less than 100 members, and it is visibly given immense publicity by some media for the very purpose of using it by utterly false association to discredit the John Birch Society. Nor is this campaign intended to serve simply the purpose of a vague and general discrediting of the society, or of merely discouraging our members and prospective members. There are plotters behind it who are obviously working towards a more specific goal. They wish to establish in the public mind and then to formalize the concept that since the communists and Ku Kluxes and John Birches are all just alike, and since the communists and Ku Kluxes are visibly subversive, then the John Birch Society is subversive too. We believe it is to this end, at least in part, that so many high-ranking politicians have been seduced into speaking out against us. 4. And now you may well ask, what have we accomplished? Well, first, we have established a nationwide educational army. It has a fully paid field staff. This army is fighting with facts as its only weapons, and the whole army knows that to be better informed is to be better armed. For help towards informing ourselves first and then others, we established a publishing division. It is now turning out books and pamphlets with a retail value of about $4 million per year. We also serve as very sizable distributors of the conservative books and reprints of approximately 100 other publishers. And our members now operate some 350 reading rooms that sell books scattered throughout the country, most of them under the name of American Opinion Libraries. We have certainly helped to reawaken, restore, and strengthen in tens of thousands of Americans the three great basic human loyalties: loyalty to God, loyalty to country, and loyalty to family. The communists know that they simply must destroy all three of these foundations of our civilization, for they can never rule peacefully, that is, without constant resistance, in any place or at any time where there is loyalty to anything except the communist state. We were the first organization in the United States to start calling widespread attention to the worldwide communist plot to discredit, demoralize, and destroy local police forces. Our members have distributed in leaflet form literally millions of our messages explaining what the communists were doing in this area and why. As a result, our Support Your Local Police drive has now won tremendous backing from patriotic citizens everywhere. We are engaged in an entirely proper and constitutional movement to bring about the impeachment of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. As only one result of our educational efforts in support of that movement, we have awakened hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens to the vital differences between a republic and a democracy. Many of them have come to realize the lengths to which our founding fathers went in order to give us a republic, not a democracy, if we could keep it. And a growing number now understand how important it is to the communists to convert this republic into a democracy as rapidly as they can. Through the distribution by our members of huge quantities of books and pamphlets, we have brought a sizable and increasing percentage of the American people to recognize the high degree of communist planning, influence, control, and purposes involved in the civil rights movement. Our increasing ability to get able, informed, and patriotic Negroes to join us in this effort, especially through continuous and widespread speaking engagements, has been an important part of this service to our country. We have helped mightily to offset the emotional and extravagant tendencies of the prejudiced and the poorly informed to blame communism on any one group or race or organization. The historical facts clearly reveal that the international communist conspiracy reaches through every conceivable body it can utilize in any way to promote its ends. And we have insisted from the beginning that we are fighting the communists and nobody else. The fact-finding subcommittee of the California Senate ended the 25,000-word report of its 2-year investigation with these paragraphs. Quote, "We believe that the reason the John Birch Society has attracted so many members is that it simply appeared to them to be the most effective, indeed the only, organization through which they could join in a national movement to learn the truth about the communist menace and then take some positive concerted action to prevent its spread. Our investigation and study was requested by the Society, which had been publicly charged with being a secret, fascist, subversive, un-American, anti-Semitic organization. We have not found any of these accusations to be supported by the evidence." Unquote. What we have accomplished above all else is to keep the John Birch Society alive and growing as a rallying point for the increasing number of informed and patriotic anti-communists. Our members have achieved this result through staggering labor and sacrifice, despite unceasing harassments and distortions of their actions, and pressures amounting in many instances to serious persecution. And we intend to keep on growing, for we believe the incredibly vicious and massive attacks on the Society have been due, in any final analysis, not to our mistakes and our failures, but to our successes and our progress. 5. And we then ask, which do you choose? We cannot give you here the full basis for that choice, but let's put down a few point-by-point comparisons of the Society with its communist enemies. 1. The communists seek unlimited power for themselves over the whole human race. The John Birch Society does not want any power at all over anybody, either now or in the future. Agreeing with Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely, the Society seeks to make progress towards its goals only by education and persuasion. 2. The communists believe that any means may be used to attain their ends, The society believes that improper means are never justified by even the noblest of aims, and that means are as important as ends in any worthwhile civilization. 3. The communists always accuse their enemies, such as the John Birch Society, of exactly those crimes which the communists themselves are committing. We do not bear false witness against anybody about anything. 4. The communists believe that words should be used to conceal thoughts and that promises are made to be broken. The John Birch Society believes that simple truth is the very core of morality, and that when we can persuade enough people to make truth the prerequisite to all statements and the accepted guide to all actions, at least half of the world's problems will rapidly disappear. 5. The communists operate in secrecy and darkness. We follow the preponderant custom among all American voluntary associations of not publishing the list of our members. With that exception, the John Birch Society has absolutely no secrets of any kind. 6. The communists seek to break down all morality, all tradition, and to destroy the whole spiritual and aesthetic sense of values which we have inherited. The Society believes that a reverent continuity in human affairs is of extreme importance, and that even the most desirable change should be made cautiously in order to be sure that it constitutes improvement. 7. The communists believe that man is just a material combination of atoms with no other purpose than satisfaction of the desires of the physical entity thus assembled. The John Birch Society believes that a divine creator has endowed man with a purpose and an upward reach which are far superior to and frequently prompt a willing sacrifice of the desires and needs of the individual himself. 8. The communists, Lenin, Lunacharsky, many others, openly preach that men must learn to hate, and that only through spreading sufficient hatred can the communists succeed in ruling the world. The John Birch Society hates nobody, not even the communists, but only the evil which they do. The Society believes that love for one's neighbor and goodwill towards all men should be a fundamental motivation in all human relationships. We have summarized the differences between the communist program and our own in the following paragraph. We must oppose secrecy with open-handedness. We must publish to the world our beliefs, our purposes, and our methods as fully as the collectivists conceal and disguise their own. We must oppose conspiracy not with counter-conspiracy, but with exposure, justice, and education. We must oppose falsehoods with truth, blasphemy with reverence, foul means with good means, immorality and amorality with more spiritual faith and dedication, rootlessness and chaos with tradition and stability, relativity with absolutes, pragmatism with deeper purposes, hedonism with a more responsible pursuit of happiness, cruelty with compassion, and hatred with love. 6. So now, how do we go about this task? What are the actual organizational mechanics of our operation? Let's make the answer as short, simple, and straightforward as we can. The John Birch Society functions almost entirely through small local chapters, usually of from 10 to 20 dedicated patriots, although some chapters may occasionally and for a while be larger. Each one has a chapter leader appointed by headquarters, which is in Belmont, Massachusetts, or appointed through officers of the Society in the field who have themselves been duly appointed by headquarters. The dues are $24 per year for men and $12 per year for women, but these are usually paid by each member of a local chapter monthly to the chapter leader at $2 per month for men and $1 per month for women. and it is among the duties of the chapter leader to collect these dues and forward them to Belmont or to the proper office of the society for the area in question. We frequently have people who want to join the John Birch Society, however, in parts of the country where we do not yet have local working chapters operating within a convenient distance. Also, health or age or other reasons may make it impracticable for some people regularly to attend such working chapters. So we have a home chapter to which such people from all over the United States or even other countries can belong. There are two differences involved here as against regular membership. One is that we cannot afford to have dues paid to the home chapter except annually in one lump sum of $24 for men or $12 for women, because otherwise we should dissipate too much of the dues money in bookkeeping costs. The other difference is that our contact with home chapter members is largely through printed bulletins, even as to the work we ask them to do, rather than through personal contact. In the case of local chapters, we expect the chapter leader to get all of his or her members together at least once a month, and in many cases oftener, as well as on any special occasions which make such a meeting advisable. And we expect the chapter leader to be in quite continuous contact with his or her members to whatever extent may be necessary in order to pass on or receive information and to carry out various concerted efforts as requested from headquarters. Next to the members themselves, our hard-working, dedicated, and long-suffering chapter leaders are the very backbone of the society. They are volunteers who serve without any pay or even reimbursement of expenses. Next above them, also serving as volunteers, are our section leaders, each of whom attends the monthly meetings of and acts as a general advisor to from 5 to 10 chapters in his area. Many of them also make recruitment presentations and perform other functions of a volunteer coordinator. And we have hundreds of these section leaders who are dedicating a tremendous percentage of their time, their energy, and their lives to the growth and the work of the John Birch Society. Then we come to the initial rank of commissioned officers in our educational army, namely our coordinators. In our ideal pattern, each such member of our fully paid field staff would have 10 section leaders under him. Each section leader would be supervising 10 chapters, and each chapter would have from 10 to 20 members. We are entirely too practical to insist on any such rigid structure, but it is a goal which we always keep in mind, as is the further goal of having between 300 and 400 coordinators throughout the United States. We have about 1/4 of that strength at the time this film is being made. Next in rank, above our coordinators, are the major coordinators, of whom we have about 8 at the present time. As the membership and organization grow, we plan to have a district governor for approximately each 10 major coordinators. But we shall add such further supervision only as we can afford it and as the need is justified by our determination to run a tight ship at all times. At present, we have no district governors, although we have 2 men serving at that rank on other jobs and without the title. At the top of the organization, we have our National Council, consisting today of 24 men. We are very proud of our council for many reasons. One is that, as has been remarked by our enemies as well as by our friends, it would be almost impossible for anybody to get together a more outstanding, successful, and highly respected group of conservative leaders on the American scene. Another is that these busy men, despite their own heavy responsibilities, travel regularly from all over the country at their own expense to attend our council meetings and continuously give so much of their time and energy and money to the program and the needs of the John Birch Society. They do this, of course, and all but 2 or 3 of them have been doing it steadily for 6 years, at tremendous cost to themselves and without remuneration of any kind. Then 4 or 5 members of the council, serving as our executive committee, still entirely at their own expense, meet even more frequently and give even more of themselves in every way to the advance of the society and its purposes. And finally, I myself, as founder of the society, do my best to keep the organization running so as to get the greatest possible value and effectiveness out of so much work and sacrifice by so many wonderful people. And perhaps it is fair and proper for me to add that, so far at least, I have been able to contribute all of my own time without ever drawing any salary from either the John Birch Society or any of its affiliated activities such as American Opinion. And now, from even this brief glance at the framework, it should be clear that the John Birch Society is no ephemeral organization of loose ties and uncertain loyalties. We are not going through a lot of pretty motions, but are building very solidly for decades to come. And we mean business every step of the way. So let's clarify a point on which we have been so widely but so unfairly criticized. For the John Birch Society is, quite frankly and by design, a monolithic body. We believe a constitutional republic to be probably the best form of government that man has yet devised. And even a republican form of non-governmental organization has many attractions and advantages under favorable conditions. But under less happy circumstances, it lends itself too readily to infiltration, distortion, and disruption. And democracy, of course, in government or organization, as the Greeks and Romans both found out, and as our founding fathers so clearly recognized, democracy is merely a deceptive phrase, a weapon of demagoguery, and a perennial fraud. For withstanding the stresses and strains of internal differences and external animosities throughout changing political climates over long periods of time, for the building of morale and loyalty and a feeling of unified purpose and closely knit strength, for effective functioning in periods of crisis and a permanence of high dedication throughout more peaceful decades. For these and many other reasons, the John Birch Society operates under completely authoritative control at all levels. The fear of tyrannical oppression of individuals and other arguments against the authoritative structure in the form of governments have little bearing on the case of a voluntary association where anybody can resign at any time and where the authoritative power can be exercised and enforced only by persuasion. And what little validity they do have is overweighed for us by the advantages of firm and positive direction of the Society's energies. Especially for the present and the near future, and for the fight against communism, which is the first great task of the Society, it is imperative that all the strength we can muster be subject to smoothly functioning direction from the top. We are quite aware that no collection of debating societies is ever going to stop the communist conspiracy from taking us over, and we have had no intention of adding another frustrated group to their number. For we are not kidding ourselves or anybody else. We really intend to stop the communists. Actually, we cut through the red tape and parliamentary briar patches and roadblocks of confused purpose with direct authority only when it becomes absolutely necessary. But whenever and wherever, either through infiltration by the enemy or honest differences of opinion, the loyalty ceases to be sufficient to keep some fragment in line, we do not let the Society's work be weakened by raging battles, nor do we permit factions to develop on the two sides to every question theme. If a conscienceless hoodlum comes into my yard, shoots my wife, and burns down my house, there are no two sides to that question at all. If this hoodlum has already been perpetrating similar atrocities in the neighborhood, and I have been trying to expose him, and for that very reason he becomes even more vicious in his murderous attack on my family and my home, the argument about there being two sides to the affair becomes even more absurd, or an even more dangerous exercise of criminal demagoguery. This brazen pretense about there being two sides to every argument has been a dangerous weapon in the hands of amoral collectivists ever since centuries before they destroyed the early Roman Republic. In the John Birch Society, those members who cease to feel the necessary degree of loyalty can either resign or will be put out. before they build up any splintering following of their own inside the society. As I have said, we mean business every step of the way. Now, we can allow for differences of opinion. In fact, working with tens of thousands of conservative individualists, we live happily at the center of a beehive of differing opinions about everything, from segregation to silver coinage, or from the teaching of Latin in public schools to the proper length of women's skirts. We need and welcome advice, and we get it by the ton. You ought to see our mail. And we use the normal measure of diplomacy, always called for in dealing with human beings. But whenever differences of opinion are blown up into acrimonious quarrels at the local level, or get translated into a lack of loyal support for the basic purposes of the society, we have shortcuts when absolutely necessary for clearing up the trouble with as little damage to morale as possible without going through any congress of so-called democratic processes. We must have, for otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the whole point, communist infiltrators could have bogged us down in interminable disagreements, schisms, and feuds before we ever became seriously effective. In fact, it would be easy to show today from actual experiences how the John Birch Society would have been torn to pieces and virtually destroyed long before now, had it not been for this ability on our part to protect ourselves from infiltration and undermining efforts of a very professional order. As it is, the communists tear their hair over this situation and accuse us of the worst thing they can possibly think of, namely, that we are just like the communists. But if you hear anybody believing such nonsense, you can point out at least one difference. If a member of the Communist Party refuses to do what he is told, they put a bullet in the back of his skull or they push him under a subway train. Our members are repeatedly told never to do anything for the society that is contrary to their individual judgments or consciences. So if a member of the John Birch Society consistently disagrees month after month with more than half of our requests, we give him back his membership dues. And we think that difference is important. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, when you join the John Birch Society, and while you are a member, we are a demanding organization. We expect, and goodness knows we receive, far more work and dedication and far more sacrifice of other interests on the part of our members than you are likely ever to have given or thought of giving to any other organization outside of your church. Because we are looking for pullers at the oars and not passengers in the boat. And you do not deserve a place among what is truly the finest body of men and women in the world unless you are willing to do your share according to your circumstances and your ability. We have established fundamental and permanent objectives much broader than the fight against the communist conspiracy because we are convinced that these ultimate long-range objectives are more important than the defeat of the communist conspiracy, but also because we are utterly convinced that we cannot stop the communists unless our efforts are a part of such a broader and more constructive purpose. Yet, it is the threat of the communist conspiracy which engages our attention so urgently today. Stopping the communists and destroying their conspiracy, or at least breaking its grip on our government and shattering its power within the United States, not only must occupy the most important spot in all of our thinking, it is the driving danger which should determine our thoughts today about almost everything else, and most of our actions too, for the foreseeable future. For unless we can win that battle, the war for a better world will again be carried on through long and futile dark ages. After we have been killed, our children have been enslaved, and all that we value has been destroyed. That is not rhetoric, and it is not exaggeration. It is a plain statement of the stark danger that is rapidly closing in on us right now. And we ask you in all sincerity, ladies and gentlemen, if the John Birch Society does not play the leading role in stopping the communists, just who is there to do so? The communists pretend to believe, and some of them undoubtedly do believe, that communism is the wave of the future. We believe instead that the whole world is now tired of so much strife and bestiality, treason and immorality, cruelty and confusion, blasphemy and destructiveness, bitterness and fear, doubt and despair that always go hand in hand with communism. We believe that mankind may be about ready to arise, shake off this communist tyranny and terror, and move forward again towards a more enlightened and humane existence. We are doing everything in our power by all honorable means to create the understanding that will produce this result. If you have what it takes in character and courage, then by all means join us now in our epic undertaking. With the added effort of people like yourself, and with God's help, when and because we have deserved it, we shall break up this immense criminal conspiracy and return a world gone crazy to sanity once again.